They've asked me to introduce this by telling you a little bit about what NCUC is. In a world of ICANN acronyms, this is a relatively old one. I'm not sure how well known it is, but it's the Non-Commercial Users Constituency. It's a mouthful. And what is it really? It's basically civil society in ICANN. And why is that important? Well, it's because ICANN is a unique institution that, instead of relying on traditional intergovernmental representation, it tries to be what we now call multi-stakeholder, and therefore it allows different groups to participate and actually be represented in its processes. Now, the reason NCUC is important is because it is a constituency that is sort of the only one that represents individual and human rights, and the people who are basically unrepresented collectively by the business interests who typically dominate ICANN processes. And I want to tell you a little bit about the origins of NCUC because it's quite telling. So NCUC really has its origins in Berlin in 1999. This was one of the first ICANN meetings. And I cannot tell you how grim the atmosphere was at that Berlin meeting. It was, first of all, it was held outside the Brandenburg Gate, where the entire city was up in arms because a neo-Nazi group was going to be parading around and demonstrating outside the Brandenburg Gate. So there was police cordons and everything. And then when you entered into this extremely fancy hotel, which made most of us feel like we didn't belong there unless we were wearing a tuxedo, you'd walk down the halls and you'd see these little rooms where people would be huddled discussing, and if you kind of poked your head in one of these rooms, someone would jump up and close the door. Everybody seemed to be involved in little circles of conspiracy because we were all forming our little groups, forming our little coalitions and political blocs that would eventually become this morass of interest representation called the Generic Name Supporting Organization and the country codes. And so there was this period of flux, of very formation of these political blocs. And of course, as usual, the general interest of the general user, without a specific commercial interest, as collective action theory tells us in political science, those people are generally not well represented. And Kathy Kleiman and I came into this meeting saying we've got to have an autonomous, independent representation for non-commercial users. We've got the trademark people are very well represented, the registrars are represented, the registries are represented, they all have resources, they all have some kind of economic power, they all are very well connected to the people who are making decisions. Who is not represented, who is consistently getting shoved aside in this process? Well, it's sort of the general public interest of users. So the attempt to form this was so controversial that we had an incredibly stormy meeting in which we could not agree. Many animosities were formed at that time, I'm sorry to say. Can't really go into the details there. It would be too long of a story. But the NC Non-Commercial Users Constituency was not even recognized, I think, until the next ICANN meeting in Argentina or something like that. And it's been a struggle the whole way. It's been a situation in which we have constantly had to fight to be recognized and to be accepted, because we were at the time kind of a voice of, we thought of it as a voice of conscience. They thought of it as one board member said, sand in the gears. You were supposed to kind of go along to get along. You weren't supposed to be raising difficult questions of public policy. At the time, ICANN was even pretending that it didn't do public policy, that it was purely a technical organization that just did coordination. And so when we said, well, the decision you just made about, let's say, domain name dispute resolution sure looks like it's something that affects trademark law, free expression rights, privacy rights, why don't we have a discussion about those issues? People just didn't want to hear this for a very long time. But we have had staying power. There are people who just wouldn't give up. And, one of the key people and the organizer of this conference, Robin Gross, during her chairmanship of the NCUC, we really grew to the size where I think we could no longer be ignored. And so we're now in a position to put on conferences like this and to raise the policy issues that we think need to be raised. And we have support from various groups. And I think we're in a position now where we are seeing the way we, which is as the people who are, the way we trying to represent people who are, the way we general interest, the rights of end users and civil society in ICANN. So that's by way of introduction to who we are and why we're here. We have a very good program today. We're looking at a variety of trade-offs that are made, or if you will, optimizations that are made between security and freedom on the internet. And one scholar who has made incredible contributions to this dialogue on internet security and its relationship to internet freedom is Ron Deibert, who of course is right here in Toronto running this wonderful institution called the Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto. And so I'm going to turn it over to Ron now. He's going to open with his keynote. Keynote? How about a blue note?
Blue note. Perfect.
All right. It's some kind of a note.
A note. Yeah.
All right.
Thank you. Bye. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome, and welcome to Toronto. Normally, I'd suggest that while you're here, you take up a hockey game, but unfortunately, there's a lockout right now. Interestingly, though, this really doesn't affect the Toronto Maple Leafs, because if the season was on, they wouldn't have any wins anyway. So I say that as a Boston Bruins fan. I take great joy in kneeling the Toronto Maple Leafs fans. I'll say a couple things about the Citizen Lab that Milton mentioned. So the Citizen Lab was formed in 2001, and the idea there was to create an interdisciplinary research laboratory. I'm a political scientist. I'm not a computer scientist or an engineer. And at that time, I was very interested in bringing together people who could work on joint projects, combining these different skill sets. The Citizen Lab is also very collaborative. We work with a number of different universities and partners. The Opennet Initiative, one of our key projects, which I helped found in 2002, along with University of Cambridge and Berkman Center at Harvard, involves partners in probably as many as 70 countries where we've been doing research on cyberspace controls over the last 10 years or so. And I guess this is the hallmark of the Citizen Lab, is we combine technical interrogation of the internet with field research and social and political and legal analysis. And part of that is the understanding that the internet itself is kind of this living, breathing organism and a kind of data set that's available to be interrogated. One of my colleagues, Janice Stein, described what we do as taking an MRI of the internet, and I think that nicely captures our approach. We lift the lid, try to find out what's going on beneath the surface of cyberspace, and I think this is different than the way most users approach it. Most users approach it the way William Gibson defined it, as a kind of consensual hallucination. They don't think much beyond their computer screens in front of them. It's a special kind of magic that just works. And of course, that's not the case at all. Once you begin to peel back the layers, you see that there's a lot going on. And the a lot going on, I think, is what I want to concentrate on right now. I think we're really at a watershed moment, and I believe that the character of cyberspace is changing fundamentally, and not for the good. And I think there are 6 big forces right now. One is the first is with respect to the nature of cyberspace as a medium, which it's not fixed. It's a constantly dynamic ecosystem that's changing all the time. And in fact, there have been enormous changes just within the last 3 to 5 years. The rise of social networking, cloud computing, and mobile. Those 3 together, I think, are really fundamentally transforming some of the principles, the architecture of what we used to think of as the internet. Among other aspects of all of this is suddenly we've created this huge explosion of data and entrusting of data to third parties, mostly the private sector, that was never there before. And of course, doing that puts a lot of onus on the private sector actors to actually govern this space. And that creates some really interesting questions around private authority. The second big change, I think, is a demographic shift that's going on. The center of cyberspace gravity, if you will, is shifting from the north and the west of the planet, where the internet was born, to the south and the east. And I won't bore you with statistics. I think most people recognize now that the vast majority of users now, presently, and certainly into the future are going to come from the global south. And these tend to be regions of the world that share certain characteristics that are different from the regions where the internet was born. And that's going to affect the internet. It's going to affect cyberspace governance. Religion plays a much more important role, generally speaking. Culture is different. Many of the regions that we're talking about are characterized by failed, fragile states or authoritarian systems of control. And I think that many of these countries are beginning to exercise a kind of foreign policy for cyberspace as well. And we see this, of course, manifest in discussions around ominous concerns around the ITU. I think that's just one symptom, that wicket meeting, of a larger trend that's happening where the future of the internet and cyberspace is going to be determined not in Silicon Valley or in DC, but in Nairobi and Shanghai and places like that. A third big issue, and it relates to the first two, is the explosion of cybercrime. And again, I won't bore you with statistics here. I think everyone in this room probably recognizes there's a serious problem here. Malware is rampant. There's an industrialization of cybercrime going on. Very serious problem. Botnets can be rented from public forums for as little as $100 that can bring down any website. Some offer 24/7 technical support. So there is this huge explosion happening. And of course, cybercrime is not new. It's been around as long as the internet. But what's happening is it's alongside this explosion of data and the coming online of these new populations in failed and fragile states where crime is quite rampant to begin with, you're seeing a globalization of cybercrime. And of course, breaches now of businesses, governments, and so on are almost a daily occurrence. Now that's worrying in and of itself, but the fourth big trend is even more concerning, and that's the blurring of cybercrime, espionage, and warfare. Our group at Citizen Lab has produced at least 2 reports I think highlight this. Most people know us for the GhostNet cyber espionage report. And that, as you may know, that began with research undertaken with the cooperation of Tibetan communities in Dharamsala and the office of the Dalai Lama. They suspected that their computers were breached and they were being monitored. And when we undertook field research and careful forensic investigation of their computers, lo and behold, they were. Now, it turns out that the same people who were infiltrating their computers were also infiltrating the computers of at least 103 countries, including many government ministries, ministries of foreign affairs, embassies, the United Nations, Associated Press, Deloitte and Touche. I mean, the victim list was astonishing even to this day. But what was interesting that most people overlooked about it is that the techniques, the tradecraft that was used in the GhostNet and other cases like it is virtually indistinguishable from the tradecraft of cybercrime. Even Stuxnet, very sophisticated computer network attack that sabotaged the Iranian nuclear enrichment facilities, while the weapon, if you will, was quite sophisticated, the delivery mechanism was not. It's largely a Frankenstein of cybercrime techniques. And that's I think, something very serious to just dwell on for a minute. Now, this is happening with a fifth big force that I see right now, which is a sea change in the way that governments are approaching cyberspace. And I think most people in this room would remember, if you go back 15, 20 years ago, and you did a canvassing internationally, what governments have policies about internet or cyberspace. If they even had one, and most of them didn't, it was a kind of laissez-faire approach. Well, fast forward to today, cybersecurity is vaulted to the top of the agendas of governments around the world. Almost every government today is producing a cybersecurity strategy. Internet content filtering, when we started out with the Opennet Initiative, there may be 2, 3 countries that were doing internet censorship. Now there are more than 45. It's become a norm, in fact. There's an arms race going on in cyberspace right now. The military, the armed forces of governments are all developing strategies how to deal with fighting and winning wars, as they call it, in cyberspace. And I'm an international relations theorist, I'm a political scientist, and those people in that field who study arms races generically, they describe certain characteristics that facilitate or encourage arms racing. And if you look at some of the principles that they outline and compare them to cyberspace, it has all the characteristics that encourage arms racing. Offense is dominant. Attribution is difficult, which makes deterrence hard. The barriers to entry are low, almost down to zero. Pressures to react quickly are very high. And so, not surprisingly, we're seeing an arms race in cyberspace, which leads to the sixth big force right now, the growth of what I call a cybersecurity industrial complex. So, as what tends to happen in circumstances like this, when governments start erecting within their armed forces and allocating large expenditures in their defense industrial base, the private sector reacts, and we're seeing a whole suite of new technologies emerging that never before existed. Technologies like deep packet inspection, cell phone tracking, geolocational tracking, computer network attack capabilities. And this market really knows no boundaries. That's again, the really perverse thing here is that technologies that are being developed in the West are finding a market in the global South and being targeted against dissidents and opposition groups in those countries. And we're finding this in our research almost on a monthly basis. A new report is coming out of the Citizen Lab. For example, we've, over the last several years, tracked the use of commercial filtering technology that's made by mostly American companies, provided to some of the world's worst offenders of human rights, blocking access to news, gay and lesbian information, WebSense, Smart Filter, and so on. It was interesting, WebSense, after our reports came out, they issued a statement saying we will no longer sell our content filtering software to regimes that violate human rights, and many people applauded it. Well, it was interesting, right afterwards, a Canadian company, NetSweeper, stepped into all of the markets that WebSense exited out of. More recently, we've seen, I think, much more troubling edges of this market around products and services for offensive computer network intrusion capabilities. And this is an interesting market. It's essentially monetizing, industrializing malware, selling it to defense and intelligence agencies, and using those products and services to target activists and dissidents. You may have seen just 2 days ago, a report of ours was covered in Bloomberg News, where a dissident in the United Arab Emirates who was arrested, beaten, tortured, and so on, presented with email transcripts during those interrogations. He thought, maybe my computer is being monitored, and so he shared some of his data with us at the lab, and the researchers analyzed it. It turned out that this was an Italian company, hacking team, that had sold this specialized intrusion kit to the United Arab Emirates. Probably that service contract would run several hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's a very lucrative market, and it's growing. So I think all of these together are creating a kind of perfect storm. And this is why I say we live really at a watershed moment. And I could see, the path that I see looks pretty bleak to me from the perspective of rights, openness, and networking. In fact, I think it's not a stretch to say if you fast forward like 50 years down the road, future historians would look back and go, there was that time in the 1990s and 2000s when citizens of the earth built this open distributed network and everyone could communicate with each other freely, and then it all shut down through censorship, surveillance, and militarization. Which is why I think there is an urgent need right now for a security strategy from global civil society, from the people who make up NCUC and others like them. Now, many people kind of bristle at that. What do you mean a security strategy for civil society? Aren't those opposite tendencies? Most people who consider themselves part of civil society think of security as a kind of anathema to what they do. They're more comfortable talking about human rights, openness, networking. Security is something that's done by the guys with the short haircuts and the things hanging in their earpieces and wearing uniforms, right? And of course, it's when you look at the talk of securitization today, there's a lot of hype, a lot of self-serving, reinforcing threat inflation. The Richard Clarks of the world are warning of digital 9/11s and electronic Pearl Harbors. And isn't this all being said to serve some narrow market incentive that I talked about, the cybersecurity industrial complex? Well, yes, certainly there's that, but that doesn't mean that the problems are not very serious. I think the problems are extraordinarily serious. Moreover, I think that there is a philosophy or a narrative around security that could be articulated by civil society but hasn't been yet. And that narrative is not something new. We don't need some fancy cyber something, In fact, the elements of a cybersecurity strategy for civil society, in my opinion, reach all the way back to ancient Greece. It's nothing new. There's a tradition of thinking about security that fits comfortably in the liberal Republican line of theorizing that reaches back to ancient Greece, runs through Rome, into the early modern period, and in the founding of the U.S. Constitution. It has at its heart principles around checks and balances, oversight, the negation of concentrated power, and that philosophy of security, I think, needs to be articulated as the basis of the principles that we should apply to cyberspace security. Because right now, the discourse is being dominated by a kind of knee-jerk delegation of this kind of discussion to the realist tradition, which is completely opposite. It's all about centralization, hierarchy, greater role for the state, concentrated power, secrecy, building barriers, and you can see all of that coming down, right? And instead, we need to articulate this robust, actually, very strong tradition that I think of as security republicanism. Now, doing so, I think, has many benefits. First of all, it can give meaning to what is now a kind of empty euphemism, multi-stakeholderism. I mean, nobody, that term is very important, but it also has a kind of empty ring to it. You know, multi-stakeholderism, it sounds very flimsy, but if you talk about it in the context of distributed security, where instead of having one central agency controlling everything in a hierarchical fashion, a more robust version of security is to have many centers of power and many different participants. This is going to sound very self-serving, but sue me for it. I think universities have a special role to play in the cybersecurity strategy for civil society. Why do I say that? Well, first of all, universities are, forget the narrative about Department of Defense inventing the internet and all that. The internet was born in universities, and it embodies all of the idealistic characteristics of the university. The peer system, network neutrality, connecting to and accessing information in an equal manner. All of those things are at the core of the university at its best. Universities are also independent, distributed, evidence-based centers of monitoring. They're also homes to interdisciplinary research. And so into the future, if we're going to protect and preserve cyberspace as an open, distributed commons of information, universities are going to have to step up to that challenge and monitor what's going on beneath the surface. I'll just end by saying that we live in paradoxical times right now. As never before are we surrounded by so much technology, and yet as never before do we know so little about what goes on beneath the surface of that technology. In fact, not only do average users not know what's going on beneath the surface, they're actively discouraged from knowing what goes on beneath the surface through laws, through secrecy, and so on. Paradoxically, as never before, are we entrusting so much of our personal information that used to be in our desktops, our filing cabinets, to third parties, to private sector actors, at the same time as we're relaxing the safeguards, the checks and balances over what they do with it, and what the state can access from them and demand from them. Paradoxically, this is the one that I find the most interesting, is that early on in the internet days, I'm sure everyone in this room will remember the old prediction that authoritarian regimes would never be able to withstand the force of the internet. Well, it turns out not only are they very adept at it, but liberal democracies are becoming more authoritarian. So it's the exact opposite of what it is. In most liberal democracies, basic safeguards for civil liberties are being rolled back. And the most secretive agencies, the signals intelligence agencies, the NSAs of the world, are stepping up, making a claim that they should be the agencies that take a leadership role in securing cyberspace for the rest of us. I mean, this is completely upside down. So I think that an organization like NCUC has a special obligation to play and a challenge before it, as do all of us who care deeply about protecting and preserving cyberspace as an open commons. Thank you very much. I have no idea what's happening now. People are approaching the podium.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ron. We really appreciate that. And we'll ask our first panelists on law enforcement, RAA, and security.